All right, thank you guys for coming at 5 o'clock. I know it's early. I probably interfered with somebody's nap, but I don't know. When I heard that you guys used to go to the pizza place and you still had church at regular time, I was like, man, it'd be terrible to say, hey, come watch Super Bowl, but we know half of it's over. So I didn't want to cancel church for football, so I just moved it early this week. Next week we'll be back at our normal time at 6 o'clock. So you can get your full nap in. Didn't want to impede on that too much. So we are in Daniel chapter 5. In Daniel chapter 5, as we are moving on, getting close to my favorite part of Daniel. And so we're making way. We're getting through. And so if you remember chapter 4, everything that was happening, we had the dreams. And then we talked about at the very end, chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar dies. So when you turn the page and you get into chapter 5, 23 years have passed. And so it's not just necessarily just turning the page or looking to the next chapter. 23 years have passed. And a lot has happened. Daniel has went into retirement at this point. He has kind of worked out of the government, and we'll see him come back in. But if you're looking at that timeline that I gave you out in the first week, that in those 23 years, it's not as if Daniel was doing nothing. We can see that he was really doing chapter 7 and chapter 8. So we learned that chapter 7, he does first in the first year of the new king, and then chapter 8, he does the third year and all the interpretations, everything that goes with that. So we have a little glimpse of those 23 years. It will be coming in a couple weeks. But for this purpose, as we're just reading through Daniel, kind of going through, just want to keep your mind kind of in check, right? So you have 1 through 4. King Nebuchadnezzar has died, and now we are in chapter 5. So Nebuchadnezzar has died. 23 years have passed. I gave you there a list of some bad kings. Babylon had a total of 7 kings. And so you can see there, Nebuchadnezzar died. Then you have evil, which was great, right? When your name starts with evil, that's good stuff right there. You can't make that up. And so you have some of them. But then if you look at that last one, Nabonidus, which I know these are all Babylonian names, and every pastor is going to pronounce them different, but we'll talk a little bit about him. And so he is the king. He is the king that is stated to be on power, kind of the ultimate king. But really tonight, chapter 5, we're looking at his kind of second in command. And so if you look at verse 1, you see that it starts out with King Belshazzar, right? And so you're kind of like, well, what's happening, right? So you kind of have this King Belshazzar, which is the son of King Nabonidus, right? And so you have this, and the king is away. He's fighting the Persians. He's doing everything. In reality, we will find out that he has already been taken over. He is already a prisoner of war. And we have all of the Medes and the Persians are already encamped all the way around Babylon. So we can say through these 23 years, a lot of change. Nebuchadnezzar was king. There was no power bigger than Babylon. And now we turn the page. They're going through many kings, but now we have a king. He's imprisoned. He's a prisoner of war. The Medes and Persians have completely surrounded most of Babylon, which is a ginormous part of the world. And basically already kind of invaded the suburbs. Like they've already beat into, so they are literally at the city walls. They are at the walls of Babylon. So everybody knows what's going to happen. All right, so it's kind of that kind of what would you do on the last day of your life kind of ordeal. This is what chapter 5 is. We kind of get kind of the reality of the last day, what it is. So you have the king has been captured, all the suburbs, everything around, and they are sitting at the city gates ready to take over and kill the second in command, which would be King Belshazzar. So What do you do on the last night? Well, we're about to find out what King Belshazzar would do. King Belshazzar, he made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. So he had a party. And this isn't just like a good, normal kind of proper banquet. These are in custom. We see these in Old Testament, New Testament. Basically, huge parties that were there for nothing but just gluttony. They would fill themselves, they would eat as much, they would drink as much, till literally they could not stand up and walk. We see this in the New Testament when Paul's talking about in 1 Corinthians about the Lord's Supper. They did something like this. We see from a guy outside of the Bible, but a famous philosopher. That's it. His name. Yep. Can I guys tell you, I moved a lot of tables, and the last duty of before everybody came over was running around my backyard picking up dog's business. So there you go. And so you're just like, wow, where's he at? What? No. Josephus would be a Jewish historian, but a famous philosopher of. I'm going to come back to it because it's going to hit me in 1 minute. You guys are all going to know what I'm talking about. You're going to be like, oh yeah, you should have known that. And I do. But anyways, these banquets are huge. Not that it was a formal, bring the kingdom in. It was to bring all of his friends, all of his accomplices in and basically just eat and drink until they could not eat or drink anymore. So what do you do on the night when you're about to die? Well, that's what he did. So he goes and he drinks wine in front of the 1,000. Now this is important when it talks about he drinks wine, because we're going to see in just a moment, but it's not just getting drunk, but it's the act of praising and worshiping other gods, which kind of gives us an insight to Daniel chapter 1, when Daniel would not want to drink the wine, right? Because remember, he wouldn't want to eat the food and the wine because it wasn't kosher, it wasn't Jewish. Now wine is Jewish, it's kosher, they can do that, but because it wasn't blessed by a priest, it was blessed to pagan gods, therefore it was non-kosher. And so it's not just drinking wine, it's the idea of all these gods, this idol worship, everything that's happening, and he's doing this in front of this large party. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and the silver of Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines, might drink from them. So now it's not just a party. Now it's not just 1,000 of his closest friends and kind of comrades and all the things, and now not just his wives and his concubines, but now he goes a step further to not just worship other gods and drinking wine, but he says, hey, remember all of the artifacts, all of the important gold vessels and all the things that my father, and we'll talk about that, but his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, took away from the temple, right, from Solomon's temple, out of Jerusalem. Bring those to this party that we might fill them up and drink out of them. So it is kind of this ultimate kind of party where he cares nothing about God. He cares nothing. He's just kind of just living to the extreme. Now, I said father. When you see that, then is that the gold and the silver that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of his out of the temple. We see that this word father is really his grandfather. But we know this, as if you remember reading, especially in Genesis, it starts, and it is a lot, but it carries throughout in the Old Testament, that in the Hebrew language and in the Aramaic language, there is no word for grandfather or grandpa or father of fathers. And so we would say today, well, maybe not today, but 100 years ago when we were all in Sunday school, we sang a song named Father Abraham. It doesn't mean that he was our father. He was our great. So you kind of pass that on. So you're going to see these words a lot, kind of father and mother, but it's not talking biological father and biological mother. We get kind of different words. So just interesting when you're reading through this to help you understand that his grandfather, that's taken everything out when he invaded Jerusalem, and taking everything out. Verse 3, then they brought in the golden vessels. They did what they were commanded, that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised God of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So we can see that not only did he pull all the things out of Solomon's temple, now he's desecrating them by drinking out of them, but also going a step further and worshiping other gods, other idols, everything that has happened. So you can kind of get the scene, right? You kind of have the biggest party, the last night of your life, where, if it was the last night of my life and I knew I was about to be taken over, maybe prayer would be a good thing, maybe some Bible study, maybe just seeking out what God wants. Well, this was the ultimate slap in the face and say, nope, we're going to go out my way. And so we see, verse 5, immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. Now, this is an interesting fashion. You can imagine 1,000 people in a big party. Everybody has eaten, buffet style and drunk. Everybody is drunk. But you can imagine that no matter the circumstance, no matter how drunk, if you saw an image, a hand started floating, a giant hand probably, writing on a wall, you can imagine it would sober you up pretty good, right? Everybody, it's always the saying, right? The fear sobers no man like anything else. And so you can imagine this huge party, thousands of people, care nothing about God, care nothing about something, and all of a sudden, you can imagine probably somebody screaming, just this big giant hand writing on a wall. You would think it would catch somebody's attention. And so amazingly, everybody kind of points to it. Now, it talks about this plaster on the wall of the king's palace. I gave you there some dimensions. We have found King Nebuchadnezzar's castle. We found the throne room. And so we see this throne room that is 56 feet wide and 173 feet long. It's a big room, and it's holding 1,000 people in it. But what's interesting is in the center of the western wall of the throne room, so not at the long end of it, dead center of it, there is, and even today, you can find there is a white plaster-like substance, and there's some chemical name for it, whatever, that is on that wall. And so they've kind of archaeologists and pulled that out. They have that, which is pretty amazing, right? You find these neat little. I'm not a big archaeology buff, but when you find things and you're just like, well, of course there was. I mean, the Bible says there was. But man, to find that and to be, 2,600 years later, we can find some of that proof. And so what would happen is they have this big white wall, which would probably been more like the theater wall. So you would have the throne at one end, and you would have everybody at this end, but on the western wall, which would be that wall, dead center, there would have been a huge part of the wall that's given with white plaster, where it would have kind of worked as a backdrop, a curtain, where you could have seen. They could have done imagery, they could have done shadows, there could have just been some a band or actors up there. It just gives a place of saying this is where the entertainment happens. So where all this happens, in the middle of the room where everybody can see this, we can see that something happens. This hand happens, that this wall was opposite of the lampstand. Gave you a little note there, lampstand. We read a lot about lampstands, especially in the book of Revelation, but also in many apocalyptic literature. But this word, lampstand, as we translate lampstand, is nowhere else in Scripture. And so basically just meaning a large chandelier containing many candles. And basically the point is that in the middle of the room, so over here, we have the wall with white plaster dead center, and it is opposite, so across the room would have been this humongous chandelier. And so basically it's giving the point of saying everybody would have saw the writing on the wall. Okay, everybody would have saw the hand. It wasn't in the dark corner behind the king's throne. It was dead center where all the attention was, where the stage would have been. It would have been there. There would have been plenty of light that was going on there. And you can imagine people saw it, and all of a sudden we see that the king saw the hand as it wrote. So probably a huge hand, the wrist down to the finger tips, and you can just imagine what that would do to somebody's, even if that happened right now. That would be odd in any stance, right? The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers, right? Here's this list again, and we're gonna read many lists tonight. That the king declared to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed in purple, have a chain of gold around his neck, and shall be the third ruler. It sounds familiar, right? Whoever can tell me what this says, and whoever can tell me what it means, then I will give you something. This is very reminiscent of Nebuchadnezzar and the dreams that he had, but now it's not a dream. It's before 1,000 people, probably the 1,000 leaders and government officials of Babylon. He sees this hand, he sees the writing, and he has no idea what it means, and he makes this same kind of Nebuchadnezzar promise. Whoever can tell me what that means, I will give you. And what shall he give? Shall be clothed in purple, which is a symbol of royalty and power among all the nations. Have a chain of gold around his neck, just simply a high office. And then also he will be the third ruler of the kingdom. Now remember, King Belshazzar, he's number 2, right? Because you have King Nebuchadnezzar, he's number 1. He is gone at war, actually prisoner of war, right outside the walls. And now he's in 2, so he can only give what's next, the third best. And if you can imagine, right, this is kind of, when you read this, when I read this, I instantly go back to Joseph, right, in the book of Genesis. You kind of see this. There's a problem. We need something. We need somebody's help. Who in the world can help? Well, we're going to find out. Then all the king's wise men came in, but imagine this, right? They could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Surprise, surprise, surprise. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. So notice this, right? So not only is you have a drunk king just totally glutted out on food and wine, now sees this, has no idea what's happening. Persia is literally at his gates, about to take over. And now he calls in the smartest and the brightest. They couldn't do it. So he's physically getting sick over all that's happening. Not just the food, not just the wine, but the pressure, the stress, all that would go in this position. We can see this is kind of an amazing part that Daniel kind of includes this, right? That even his color is being changed. Verse 10, the queen, because of the words of the king and of his lords, came into the banqueting hall, and the queen declared, O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. Now, let's talk about this queen. This queen is not his wife. We've seen that his wife, his wives, plural, and his concubines were already in the room, right? They were already in the room. They were drinking from the vessels from Solomon's temple. So this is somebody different. So who is this? Well, this is Nitocris. This is the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. This is the mother of Belshazzar, right? So it's the queen, the ultimate queen. But notice who she is, right? So she is the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. Now you can go outside of the Bible and you can read a lot about Queen Nitocris. Queen Nitocris was a very wise and cunning woman. If you kind of go outside of Scripture, there's not anything ever written bad about her. She was brilliant. She was wise. She was cunning. Much like every other house, in the world, right? The woman is the brains of the operation, right? And so she was that brain. She was that person that helped her father Nebuchadnezzar and helped some kings before Belshazzar. And now we're going to see that she comes in and she says, "Oh, King, love." She kind of does her things. But notice, she wasn't at the party. She wasn't invited. She's not, and you would think like, wow, wouldn't you invite, the kings? But she wouldn't have, because we're about to find out she knows something that's a little bit different, right? She knows she probably wouldn't have want to be there. But she heard all the commotion. She comes in and gives her greetings, and then basically does what a good mother does. Hey, calm down. Don't let this alarm you. Don't turn green on me yet. Don't puke, right? Hold on. There could be an answer here. Verse 11, there is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, that would be your grandfather, in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your grandfather, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar. So we see an interesting situation. The queen is not in the party. She wasn't invited to the party. Maybe she was invited, but she's not in the party, right? She doesn't want a part of what's going on. But there's a problem, and then the queen comes in and says, there's somebody here that can solve you, that can solve this issue. Kind of like, hey, young whippersnapper. You can imagine this young king, even being a grandson, thinks he knows everything. It just happens. And he says, before you were even thought of, there was a king. There was a guy. There was a guy that would help out your grandfather. And it's very interesting when you read this. It points out that she says things that would kind of illuminate this idea of she holds Daniel at a higher standard, right? She holds him to be well, because she says things. She goes on and she says, the wisdom of gods were found in him. And the king Nebuchadnezzar, your father, the father of the king, made him chief of the magicians, the enchanters, again. And so she's going back and she's giving him a history lesson, right? Hey, young grandson, let me tell you, when the real king was here, there was a guy that helped the real king, the king that controlled all of Babylon, the king that's not about to get taken over by Persia. And even at that, he had problems, but he didn't look to himself. He didn't look to these people. He found somebody that could help him. And this somebody was the Spirit of God was in him. And he had the wisdom of all the gods, which means not that all the gods helped him, but he had the wisdom of a God that was greater than all of the gods. So we can see that his grandma is holding Daniel to an interesting kind of level. But what's most interesting is what she called him. She called him Daniel, right? She called him by his Hebrew name, not his Babylonian name. So Nebuchadnezzar is dead. His ego and logo is far gone now. And now you have this woman that remembers what Daniel did, holds him to a high extreme, and now even refers to him by his given Hebrew name. His name is Daniel, whom Nebuchadnezzar, gave a Babylonian name. And now the king, the young king, says, now let Daniel be called. He refers to him by his Hebrew name. Now this isn't just a name. It's not like us when we say, oh, okay, where does your name come from? They would have instantly known, right? They would have instantly known this is a Jewish name. This is a name from the Israelites that were taken over. So the temple that you destroyed and took the vessels that you're drinking wine and getting drunk out of, this Jewish man, let him come and see if he can help me. Let Daniel be called. Now remember, 23 years have passed. Daniel is an older man right now, right? He was well into his 80s, and so he's retired, he's out, he's no longer in the government, but to be called, and he will show you the interpretation. Then Daniel was brought in. I don't know, when I'm 80, I'm going to need people to help bring me in physically, like push a wheelchair, but I don't know, we don't know what that means, but he was brought in before the king, and the king answered and said to Daniel, You are that Daniel. Notice the Hebrew name. It just keeps on. It's so amazing. You are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king, my grandfather, brought from Judah. I have heard of you that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that the light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now notice this, right? This is verse 14. The king is telling Daniel, oh, I've heard of you. But notice what he said. He just repeated what his mom said, right? He didn't really know about Daniel. He didn't care about Daniel, right? These young kids today, they don't care about the history, everything that, right? And it's true, right? Even that, the king, this young king that's taken over as his dad is at war, he's kind of taken over, and so we can see that he doesn't really know, oh, I've heard of you, Daniel. Please help me. He's basically sucking up to Daniel. Like, oh, I've heard of you, so great. But he's literally just repeated what his mom just told him. It's just kind of funny. Verse 15. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me and read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not show the interpretation of this matter. Now Daniel has to be holy, because in there, if it was me, it'd be like, of course they didn't. I mean, they never have. But, okay, it goes on. But I have heard, I've heard, his mom told him, I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now, if you can read the writing and make it known to me, its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck and shall be the third ruler of the kingdom. You can imagine Daniel is going, oh, whatever, man. I don't need this, right? I'm just like, you're nothing. I dealt with your grandfather, King Nebuchadnezzar, who did everything, and I interpret dreams, and I even told him what his dream was, and then the interpretation. And you just want me to read some writing on a wall and be like, oh, you're going to give me what? Oh, you're going to give me the third, oh, man. Nebuchadnezzar has given me so much more. He promised me so much more. I don't need this, right? Verse 17, and Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself. I don't need your junk. And give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. Just imagine. Okay, so just get your idea, get your head around this. In a room, 1,000 people, totally gorged out on food, drunk. They're literally living and drinking for their last night of their life. Okay, Persia is about to come in and kill them. And then all of a sudden, this big hand writes on the wall. And you just imagine, like all these people are around, and then these people are screaming, and the king doesn't have an idea, so the king is looking dumb in front of the 1,000 people that he has there in his party. So then he brings in the best of the best, the smartest of the smartest, the brightest of the brightest. They have no clue. And then his mommy has to come in. Okay, I mean, just get this picture, right? His mommy comes in. The 1,000 people are still there. His mommy comes in and says, yeah, there's a guy. There's like this 80-year-old man that can help you. Let's just bring him in. And so he comes in, and the king has to humble himself before this 80-year-old man. Oh, wise Daniel, I've heard of you. You're the best. You're the greatest. You have all the wisdom. Oh, please tell me what this means. I'll give you the royalty. I'll give you the chain. I'll make you an officer. I'll give you the third in command over my country, even though it's about to be taken over. I'll give you everything that you want. And this 80-year-old man gets up in front of all of his friends and all his accomplices and says, oh, it's almost nap time. I don't need your junk. I don't need your position. I don't need your gold. I don't need your robe. Yeah, I'll tell you what it means. I mean, just imagine, just the whole idea of everything's happening. I mean, the 999 people in that room that's not the king. Do you think they're like, oh man, King Belshazzar, he is so wise. We're thinking, man, this guy doesn't know anything, right? His leaders don't know anything. His enchanters don't know anything. His magi don't know anything. His mommy had to come in. I mean, you can imagine for a king at this level, you can imagine all that's happening. It says, verse 18, O king, The Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father, kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. So they call in Daniel, his Hebrew name. He was serving a Hebrew God. And then the first words out of his mouth to talk about this interpretation, he instantly gives God all the credit, right? O king, the Most High God, the God that is above all the other gods that you're in here drinking and celebrating of, the God whose temple that you're now drinking wine out of the vessels that they have, that you're drinking out of, that Most High God, He allowed your granddad to be the king. He allowed him. And so you just have to imagine the idea of like, Nebuchadnezzar is that name that no matter who's king, he was the greatest king of Babylon. Across the board, in the Bible, out of the Bible, does not matter. Hands down, the biggest and the greatest king. And so you can imagine every time that they would probably say King Nebuchadnezzar, they were all, like bowing down or something. I mean, this is sacred. And now Daniel comes in and says, you remember your great-grandfather Nebuchadnezzar? Oh, he's the greatest. My God just allowed him to be. My God gave him everything. He wasn't nothing without my God. Verse 19, and because of the greatness that he gave him, that God gave him, all peoples and nations and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened, so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. So imagine, he comes in, and 1,000 people there, the best of the government, he says, you remember your grandfather Nebuchadnezzar? Everybody bows down, and every time he says it, this has to happen, right? And he says, he was nothing compared to my God. My God allowed him to do, gave him all the power, all the people. He allowed everything happened to him. And he let Nebuchadnezzar keep reigning until he got too big for his britches. Right? Until his pride took him over. And when his pride took him over, that was it. Right? He brought him down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. You guys remember that? Eating like an animal, 7 years, long hair like eagles on a feather, nails like talons of a bird, eating grass, outside, moo. The new Chick-fil-A guy. You guys remember that? That's where he was at, right? The king of the known world lost his mind. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that, the beast, and his dwelling was that, the wild donkeys. And he was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets it over whom he will. And so we can see this idea that this old 80-year-old man is giving this young whippersnapper king kind of the rundown of the history that says, my God can do anything. My God is always in charge. Which if you got to pick like the ultimate book kind of theme of Daniel, that's it right there, right? God is always in charge. And so we have this idea that no matter what, God is in charge. So of course, I can tell you about these 4 words on your wall. Verse 22, and you, his son, his grandson, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all his. But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. And so what's interesting is Daniel talks about Nebuchadnezzar. He's great. God gave him all his power, but pride let him down, and God took care of him. And then he says, but you, O king, now remember, he's still in his throne room. There's 1,000 people around, right? You, O king, you're falling in the same path. You have not humbled your heart. And it's worse for you because you knew what your grandfather went through. You knew about his pride. You knew all that he did. You knew all that God did. You know in the past, you know everything that happened, and you didn't do anything, but instead, you doubled down and you've lifted up yourself against the Lord. His pride has gone against God just like his grandfather. And the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine for them. They went and said, this is the God of Israel, this is Yahweh, and now they're making fun of it, right? They're disgracing this. And so not only are they prideful, now they're disgracing God, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron and wood and stone, which you do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. And so all of a sudden, you can imagine this young king in front of his 1,000 guests is just being told, right? You're worse than Nebuchadnezzar. You knew his problem of pride. You've doubled down. You've been 10 times worse than he has. You're not only prideful, but now you're going against him and you're desecrating this God and you're drinking wine out of this while you're worshiping other idols. And it just kind of goes on and on and on. In verse 24, then from his presence the hand was sent and this writing was inscribed. And so you can imagine, right? Remember what God did to King Nebuchadnezzar? He drove him mad. He was out. He was in the field for 7 years until he realized that God reigned on high. And then his mind was brought back to normal. And his kingdom was given back to him. And it was going to be bigger than it ever was before. But he died. So now you've doubled down. You're more prideful. Now you're desecrating. You've done all this. And the reason that this hand has come is become from the God who you've made really mad. It's come from the God that you said you didn't need. It's come from the God that you're drinking wine out of the holy vessels that you've been given. Right? So you can imagine, he's setting this up, right? He's giving the story. Oh, I can tell you what this means, but you need to understand, before I tell you the message, where this is coming from. God is giving you a message. A God that King Nebuchadnezzar, great King Nebuchadnezzar, went mad about because he was more prideful, and it took him 7 years to realize that God was the Most High God. And so he goes on, verse 25. And this is the writing that is described. Mene, tekel, upharsin. Now, that's Aramaic, and of all the things I speak, it's not Aramaic. So if that's not the pronunciation, there you go. That's mine, right? So everybody says it different. But anyways, this is the writing. We see these 4 words. In these 4 words, in your English Bible, you'll see 5 words, right? You see mene, you see tekel, and then you see pharsin, right? In the writing, that's because we're reading English. They put it in English and they put it in Greek and Aramaic. But really, it would have been 4 words, and the word pharsin would have had a U in front of it. And the word U means and. So your English Bible puts in the and. So it really would have been 4 words. You see 5, you just see the and we take off that U, right? So I just want to kind of help you understand, because you're like, you're not saying and, right? So this is kind of what happens. So we see these words. And to understand more about these words, there's a couple things, right? There's no vowels. So when we read them in our English Bible, we get the vowels to help us out. But in the vowels, I gave you at the bottom, or kind of in the, I guess like the 3rd dot, what it would look like in English. But also, like Hebrew language, we don't read left to right, we read right to left. So Hebrew, everything is inverted, right? So you read from the right side of the book to the left. So you read from the spine in, right? Spine out, right? So there's no vowels. Everything is completely inverted. And so it would have looked like this in English letters, right? So you see the SRP, the LQT, the NN, the NM, right? So that's what it would look like, but it would have been, of course, not in English letters. It would have been in Aramaic letters. This message could have meant many different things. When you see this, when you see these words, and we'll talk more about what these words mean in just a moment, they have a lot of meanings. And depending on what you do, and a lot of people make it go a lot of different ways, okay? And so just like that day, so as the Chaldeans, the Magi, the astrologers, the pharmacists, and all these people, the sorcerers, they come in, they see these words. These are not like words, they didn't know what they were. They knew what these words were. These are common words, but they could have mean many different things. And do you really want to be the bearer of bad news? in front of 1,000 people, in front of your king who's really got one night to live, this was really not a good deal, right? So they probably just did not say. But we see, here's what was written on the wall. Verse 26, this is the interpretation of the matter. So here we go. Here's what it works, right? So you see the word meaning, not like somebody's mean, but you see the word meaning. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. The word meaning means number, counted, measured. And so what he's saying is that your days, they're counted. God knows what's going to happen. Kind of, your time card is now taken away. Your time is up, right? So your days have been numbered. Then we see the word tekril. Tekril, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. And so you get this picture of a scale, right? Tekril, you have a scale, and so you have kind of Belshazzar on one and what God wants on the other. And it's kind of what we've been talking about on Sunday morning, right? Your works, your faith, your holiness to God, you're found in wanting. You're on the low side of the scale, right? You're not on the good side. And so that's what it's talking about. And then we see verse 28. We see Perez or Farsin. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And so I put there, Perez means divided in past tense, but if you notice, the word is very similar to the word in Persia. So the Persians, who are literally on the outside of the wall, everybody in the kingdom knows what's about to happen, right? They know that the Persians are there. They know they're about to kind of go to war. So even not the brightest crown in the crown box would have figured out this could be something about Persia. That's why I said it has a lot of different meanings, right? So it has this numbered, has this weighted, and it has this divided slash Persia. What does all this what does this really have to mean? And then it says, verse 29, and Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with a purple chain and gave him everything that he was around his neck. A proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. So notice, he tells him, okay, yes, I can read this, and here's what they mean. But he hasn't truly gave him the interpretation, right? He hasn't told him the bad news yet. He gives him this, and so the king says, oh, you're so bright, you're so brilliant, I'm giving you everything that I promised. And then we see in verse 30, that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. And so he receives this, but he doesn't fully understand what's going on, right? He doesn't, if you found out you're about to die, I don't know if that's the time that you're the most giving, right? It's kind of like, it's kind of different. And so when this hand writes on the wall in front of all of his guests at this last night, at this big party, to celebrate the king, right? The king worshiping all the other gods, God sends this hand, this monster hand. I would love to know how big the hand was, right? It's just like, in my mind, it's bigger than those. I mean, it would have been a hand that 1,000 people could have saw, right? I mean, they just kind of like, all right. It would have been been a big hand. But you see this hand writing on the wall, and he basically says that your days are numbered, weighed, and divided. Your days are numbered. You have been weighted. You've been found wanting to God, and your kingdom is about to be divided, which Persia comes in. Darius the Mede received the kingdom. Now, a little Jeopardy note, just to keep you wanting, because I really don't have the answer for this, but the word Darius, and we talk about Darius a lot here in Esther, and his name is found in several places. It is probably a position title. It's not his real name, right? His name is not Darius. That's not Sean. It could have been Sean, I guess. I don't know, but probably not. Darius, and so it's an official position, kind of like Caesar, right? When we read about Rome, it's always Caesar. Darius would have most likely have been a position title. Would have been the Persian Caesar, not necessarily his name, even though we always refer to Darius as a name. So we can see in this, Nebuchadnezzar dies, verse 5, all this happens, this big party, everything's happening, but once again, we see pride takes him down. So if you have your flow chart and you're kind of going, notice that the number 5, here's the 3 things I want you to take away, is a king's pride. Right? King's pride. Second, even more pride. And number 3 is death. And the reason, if you look at that flow chart, you have 1, then you have 2, 3, 4, and 5, right? 4 and 5, there's an arrow. They tie together. Nebuchadnezzar, there was a pride issue, right? Belshazzar, there was a pride issue. King Nebuchadnezzar, 7 years of craziness led him for some forgiveness. He realized that God was the Most High God. But what happened? Belshazzar was on this last night with a kingdom around him, and he doubles down, right? He desecrates God and desecrates everything he stands for, and so shows even more pride. And so Nebuchadnezzar, who says, God, you're the most God, he gets restored. He gets back his kingdom grows bigger than ever before. But Belshazzar, who doubles down on the pride, what happens? He dies. And so we kind of see that why they tie together. Well, as we kind of go back up the flow chart, we'll see why these tie together. Now remember, that middle section is in Aramaic, right? So it's written for the world. It's not written for Israel. It's written for the world, right? So we're starting to see some things. Why does